Well, in this episode we're going to take a close look at composting. Now, I don't think there's anything more satisfying than having an allotment or a little patch of garden and recycling the scraps from the kitchen and waste from the garden into that lovely rich, dark, friable compost that you can grow next year's crops on. I mean, everything around me here is growing on compost that I made last year, and it's thriving. Compost gives your allotment everything it needs: rich organic matter, lots and lots of fertility. It's great stuff. And people often say, well, don't you just chuck it in the bin at the bottom of the garden and let it get on with it? Well, if you want to make good compost, there's a little bit more to it than that. Now, the best place to start is to divide everything you put into your bin into two basic categories: either green stuff or brown stuff. So when I'm talking about green waste, I'm really talking about material that's very high in moisture and very high in nitrogen. And that falls into two basic groups. The first being kitchen scraps. Now, this is the stuff you collect in the kitchen and maybe a little caddy. I just use a carrier bag by the back door, pick it up, and when it's full, bring it down to the allotment, chuck it on the compost heap. So it's things like potato peelings, we've got some carrot peelings here, old banana skins, bits of old salad, lots of celery, because that's horrible, no one likes that. Things like apples, if you're going to chuck apples in, just smash them up before you chuck them in, otherwise they're a bit resistant to breaking down. So anything that's big, just chop it up and smash it up before you chuck it in. Things like coffee grounds and tea bags, a bit of an in-betweener really. They're not cooked but maybe a bit stewed. Coffee grounds are great, just chuck those in. Tea bags, they're a bit of a classic really, because if you don't tear them up and sprinkle them on the compost, they sort of go through the composting process and come out as tea bags, and then you have a garden covered in tea bags. So just rip them up before you chuck them in. And things like eggshells as well, you can crush those up, chuck those in, they certainly won't do any harm. And a good tip: always buy your eggs in cardboard egg boxes, because you can then compost the eggshells and also the box. So the other category of green waste we're going to talk about is the sort of stuff you get straight out of the garden. So things like maybe you've been hoeing the allotment and you've got lots of green weeds, or harvesting crops and you've got lots of tops and lots of trimmings. So readily compostable, full of moisture, good stuff. And then finally, grass clippings. Now, a lot of us are going to have far too many of these. It's rocket fuel. You know, you add it to your compost heap and your compost goes boom. It's great stuff. You know how good it is when you can put it in a bin bag and on a warm day it'll just start composting by itself. But too much of it, and it'll make your compost really wet and claggy and smelly. So we need to counterbalance that with lots of nice dry twiggy material. But if you use with caution, great stuff. So when I'm talking about the brown stuff, I'm talking about material that's very low in moisture and has got a very high carbon and sort of cellulose content. So things like the prunings out of your herbaceous border, or any shredded woody garden waste, are very important really. It's like the scaffolding of your compost heap. Practically, also things like straw, big favourite of mine. I tend to have a little bale of straw tucked away somewhere at the back of the allotment, just to add to the compost if it's starting to get a bit wet and a bit claggy. Very useful indeed, and you can get little ones from the pet shop, so you don't have to spend a lot of money. If you've got a small animal like a rabbit, or quite a lot of people keep poultry, they're often bedded on sawdust. Another excellent addition. Again, lots of carbon in there. It's going to really add to the structure of the heap and give you that sort of essential scaffolding really, to let the air in, let the moisture out. You could also use things like egg boxes. Any of this sort of pulpy cardboard is quite useful. Soak it first, tear it up, you can chuck that in. Newspaper in moderation, your sort of confidential document shredding, that could go in, I suppose. I'd avoid too much coloured print, that won't break down very well. But also things like, this is the infamous Amazon packaging, torn up, maybe soaked in water before you chuck it in. It's sort of a suitable and fitting end, and it certainly won't do any harm. Now, Now, having talked about the things we can compost, I guess we better talk about the things that we can't. Things like cooked food, they tend to putrefy rather than compost. They can attract vermin and you get mice and rats and things. It doesn't make you a good neighbour, so leave cooked food out of the compost. Plastics, you always find a few plant labels, but any sort of plastic is going to tend to just come out of the process pretty much the same as it went in, so keep that out. Teaspoons, you always find teaspoons in compost. I've actually got some dessert spoons here. I've gone up a level, and they always come out shiny and new, and you find those next spring when you're digging your compost out, so there's not much point in putting those in. Soil, now excess soil in the compost heap can really slow it down and make it quite sluggish, so when you're putting your weeds in and things, just shake all the soil off that you can and try and keep that out of your compost. Also things like babies' nappies. Now I have been told that you can get biodegradable nappies. I tell you what, let them biodegrade somewhere else, because in your compost bin they're not going to be good. You might catch something, but also you're going to end up with a ton of baby poo in your garden, and you're going to have to pay someone to take it away, because in my experience it's just not a great thing, and it's probably not going to work. So keep those out. And the same can be said for domestic cat and dog waste, and litter as well. It's going to cause all sorts of problems for you, and it's really quite hazardous, so keep those out of the compost bin too. So here we are, a fairly modern compost bin. Solid plastic, little trapdoor at the bottom so you can get your compost out. Lid comes off, and then it's open bottom, so that'll allow soil life to migrate in and migrate out freely. Should be fairly effective. So, to get the best from a little bin like this, you've got to think about building the thing up in layers. It's so easy just to stick in grass clippings and kitchen waste and green weeds, and it gets greener and wetter, and then you get the flies and the smell, and it just doesn't work very well. So, every time you chuck in a bag full of kitchen scraps and grass clippings and the likes, put those all in, I think. Don't get too mixed up with that lot. You then balance that out with some dry material, so a layer of dry woody material. And now you can see why it's so important you sort your stuff out into different groups, so that you can balance out the wet stuff with the dry stuff, the brown stuff with the green stuff. So we'll build a little layer of that up, spread that out, and so on. What you need to do now, layer dry stuff, so hopefully next time we can put some green stuff on top of that, then mix in a bit more dry stuff. If you want, you could have a little bale of straw next to your bin, and then if it's just all grass clippings coming out of the garden, you can just pull a bit of straw out, mix it in and dry it up a little bit. But just be conscious that you've got to try and maintain that balance. It's a ratio of 50-50 really, which is always sort of tragic news to gardeners, because they've always got far more green waste than dry waste. But it really is important to keep the compost open, let the air in and let the moisture out. Now, in an ideal world, we'd have a big pile of green waste and a big pile of dry waste. We'd mix the two together and fill our bin to the top. A few cans of water and boom, the whole thing will just roar away. And that's all the fungi and bacteria using the available nitrogen in the green material to break down the woody, cellulose dry material. And it gets really hot, I mean up to 45 degrees C. And as it cools, so all the soil life comes marching in, worms and wood lice, and they start crunching and munching and breaking down all the larger bits in your compost to get it down to that lovely dark friable material that we want for our garden. Now, people often ask me, is it worth turning the compost heap? Well, if your bin's been stood around for a while, you can mix it, that will open it up and let some air in. You could even dig in a few more grass clippings and sort of warm the whole heap up again. It's quite difficult to do sometimes in a bin like this, because it's quite confined. I mean, you could take the bin off and turn it back into the bin in a different position. Or you can use something like this. This is called a composting tool. It's a bit like a metal walking stick. This one's got little sort of flanges on the end that pop up when you push it in and then pop down when you pull it up. And it's quite good. You can sort of get into all the corners, and it can actually do quite a nice little job when you're trying to turn a small bin like this. So, how much should I water my compost? Or should I water it at all? Well, if it's going to rain, you could just leave the lid off for the night and let it naturally pick up some moisture if you're out on an allotment somewhere. But every now and again I just stick the hose pipe over it, get it nice and damp. I know you're putting green material in and there's probably a lot of moisture going into the heap, but actually keeping the whole heap nice and turgid and wet really keeps the whole process going. So a bit of water every now and again is a really good idea. So when it comes to using your compost, in theory, you should be able to open the little door and beautiful black compost comes pouring out the bottom. It never works like that. Generally, I have to take the bin off, rake through it, get the good compost out, and anything that hasn't composted, just chuck back in and let it go through the process again. So in all this chat about compost, we've not actually looked at the finished product, have we? So here's our little trapdoor on the bottom of the compost bin. We'll just take this off. Have a look in here. So we've got, let's have a dig around, see what it's like. Go. So it's got all sorts of goodies in here. Bits of old eggshell that haven't decomposed. There's a few wood lice running around, a few worms as well, doing their job, breaking it down for us. Important to remember, when we talk about compost, this is very different to, potting compost or the sort of thing you get from the garden centre. This is more akin to garden manure. So this is a very rich source of fertility, and we're going to be sticking this on the land to grow future crops. Okay, well I hope you've got one or two insights into the composting process, and do join us again for the second in this series, where we'll be looking at all the bells and whistles and refinements you can add to your composting process to make it even more successful and hopefully more enjoyable as well. So yeah, good luck, and we'll see you again soon. Now, in an ideal world, we'd have a big pile of green waste and a big pile of dry waste. We'd mix the two together and we'd fill our bin in one go. Chuck on a few cans of water and boom, off it would go. It can get up to 40, 45 degrees C, and that's all the fungi and bacteria getting to work using bloody bells.